Hello everyone, thanks very much for joining me again on this rather overcast day in Taipei. So a few days ago I was reading about the Nordstream gas pipeline. As I'm sure you know, in the news recently there's been an incident on it, and I was vaguely aware of its existence before, but the engineering of it's quite impressive. It's one of the longest gas pipeline systems in the world, about 1,200 kilometers end to end, and each one takes around 30 gigawatts of thermal equivalent gas from Russia to Germany. So that's quite a lot, albeit of course it's polluting and exhaustible fossil fuels. Anyway, you think that might be an interesting topic for a quiet moment in the office, and in my office there are many quiet moments. So I went up to a colleague of mine and I just made some offhand chat about Nord Stream. You know these pipelines the Russians blew up, I opened up with, and he was like, "Oh, you mean somebody blew up?" I was like, well, I mean, the Russians blew up. Well, it could have been anyone, couldn't it? And I'm like, well, it could have, but it wasn't. It definitely was the Russians, right? And he's like, well, I don't think so. It might have been anyone else. Anyway, it's not the first conversation I've had like this over the last few months. And it got me to thinking, why am I so sure that the Russians blew this pipeline up? And I have to say, following a little bit of reflection and a little bit of dusting off some of my old notes from 20 years ago when I joined the Navy, I can come up with something a little bit more grounded to back it up with. And because I don't want you to have to watch the entire video before reaching my conclusion, I can tell you, yes, the Russians definitely did it, and the rest of this video I'm going to explain why they did it, and also the rather worrying connotations that has about other things, all right? So first off, it's probably worth us putting a little bit of context into this. I'm sure many of my viewers are familiar with this, but nonetheless, let's go on. So it was the 24th of February 2022 when Russia began a brutal, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. As of now, that invasion has stalled, and with Western support in the form of weapons and intelligence, the Ukrainians have started to dramatically take back ground that the Russians had taken over earlier in the conflict. So it's pretty clear that the Russians are losing this, and what is more significant than the fact that they're losing it, they realise that they're losing it. So against this background of mounting losses, punishing sanctions and increasingly unpopular mobilisation strategies, at the onset of this winter, on the 26th of September 2022, at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning local time, a series of explosions occurred located off the Danish island of Bornholm. Subsequent investigations revealed that 4 explosions had happened, one for each of the 4 pipelines in the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 combined system. None of the pipelines were transporting gas at the time these explosions occurred. However, they were pressurized to approximately 200 bar, and needless to say, all that gas came bubbling up to the surface and created gigantic puddles over a kilometer in diameter of bubbling, foaming seawater. Some hours later, all the pressure in the pipeline system was lost, and due to the nature of the leaks, the pipelines are completely unusable. It's worth noting that these are not trivial pieces of infrastructure. As I mentioned at the start, these pipelines are very powerful in terms of the energy that they can deliver to Europe. And in order to deliver that energy, they're approximately 1.2 meters of internal diameter, with a steel wall 40 millimeters thick, covered in a layer of about 15 centimeters of concrete, which provides mechanical connection and also weighs the pipelines down onto the seabed. On the inside of the pipeline, you've got a thick epoxy coat, and if the pipelines are made anything in the way offshore wind lines are made, and I've no reason to suspect that they're not, they're going to be buried at least a meter underneath the surface of the sea. These are not things that go bang. We can rule out completely, immediately, and without any fear of being sloppy, any form of accident, never mind 4. Why do these pipelines exist? Well, predominantly it's our Teutonic friends, isn't it? So Nordstream 1 was connected about a decade ago, and subsequently Nordstream 2 was built, which was about to be commissioned at the start of the Ukraine war but never went into full operation. And these pipelines channel gas directly from Russia to Germany. And many people, even in Germany, pointed out the complete fallacy of this, because at some point anyone with even a modicum of a brain would have predicted that this exact situation could occur. But no, no, said the Germans, led by the redoubtable Ms. Merkel.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
By doing business with the Russians, she continued, they will come round to our way of thinking, you know, just like the Saudi Arabians did, and just like the Afghanistanis did, and not at all like the South Africans did after a generation of punishing sanctions. The result of this is that the invasion of Ukraine has been paid for, and continues to some extent to be paid for, by billions and billions and billions of dollars of Western money, which has been pumped into Russia in return for gas that they scuff out of the ground basically for nothing. These pipelines require very heavy shoreside infrastructure, particularly in the form of pumps, and the pumping systems on these pipelines run into several hundred megawatts, and they are based on industrial gas turbine units. Russia's primary excuse for not using Nord Stream 1, for example, for a number of months has been that they are overhauling the gas turbines, and due to the horrible and completely unprovoked sanctions that the West are giving them, you know, they can't get the spare parts. Well, of course it's nonsense, but it's vaguely plausible, right? So, to summarise what I've just said, what we have is a large, heavy, extremely solidly built piece of infrastructure that's completely vital to the long-term interests of Western Europe as it stands today, experiencing an explosion that will render it completely useless for many years, even if the decision was made to repair it. Who did it? And more interestingly, why did they do it? To answer these questions, I'm going to look at the events of themselves and use the information that we have from those events to form a relatively logical argument with a form of diagrams as to why it was the Russians that did it and what that means for us in future. So, what do we know?
There are known knowns. There are things we know we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
So we know that these things have gone bang. There are plenty of ways to immobilize a pipeline. We've seen that the Russians have done this for the last few months by pretending that their compressors aren't working. So to immobilize a pipeline, it is not necessary to blow the damn thing up. If you're going to blow the damn thing up, people are going to notice that it's been blown up. And you, as the person blowing it up, are going to know that they're going to notice that you're blowing it up. I rooted around through my old Navy notes and I found a series of very old diagrams like this one, which are applicable. However, I also found some simpler ones, i.e. this diagram here. Now, this diagram here was created by a good guy called Dr. David Kilcullen from the University of Arizona. And it concerns his theory on thresholds of conflict. So what we see in this diagram is a 4-level structure, and you have overt conflict, which you might call conventional warfare, at the top. And you have clandestine activity at the bottom, and in between you have covert operations and ambiguous action. You'll also notice on the diagram that you have 3 levels: the response threshold, the attribution threshold, and the detection threshold. And what do they mean? And we also see that there's a liminal zone indicated between the response threshold and the detection threshold. And the reason that I find this chart, which is a simplified version of the one I showed you before, useful is because it is simplified, and the Russians in particular, when they're not blowing the shit out of Ukraine, have a particular affinity for operating in the liminal, or what I might refer to as the cowardness zone. Now, clandestine activity, it's activity that might be conducted by an agent but the operation and the identity of the agent and the perpetrators are unknown. In other words, the operation probably, from the point of view of an external observer, never even happened. So this would cover most kinds of intelligence gathering missions, for example, as well as various sort of political sponsorships, you know, dirty money channeling into various political parties, lobbying, maybe small-scale dispersed sabotage in a form that could be put down plausibly to routine equipment breakdown, that kind of thing. You could also claim that a successful false flag operation would fall into this category, but I'm going to speak a little bit more about that later. As operations intensify, you tend to cross the detection threshold. So in this region, these are operations where it's obvious that something has happened, but it is not obvious who did it. And these tend to be covert operations of various forms. This gas pipeline explosion is a perfect example of this covert operation above the detection threshold. The next level up is the attribution threshold. So above this, we're in the region of ambiguous action, where something has happened, it's pretty clear who did it, but there's still enough plausible deniability to perhaps curtail some sort of direct and immediate response. So ambiguous action would cover political assassinations, for example, particularly the type that Russia and North Korea and various other countries, Saudi Arabia, have been conducting recently, where it's been pretty clear what's happened and it's been pretty clear who did it, but there's still a level of plausible and political deniability in the action. Operating in this region can be extremely hazardous because the enemy's response threshold is both unknown and unpredictable. It would be relatively easy to overreach and invite a deliberate response from the enemy, which, if they're more powerful than you, could be disastrous. And a good example of this would be Afghanistan in 2001. Now, again, I'm not here to debate the morals or otherwise of the invasion of Afghanistan, but it is true that an ambiguous operation significantly exceeded the American threshold of action, and that did not go well for Afghanistan. As I said, this diagram is a simplified model, versions of which have been floating around for a long, long time. But taking it at face of value, we can see that the attack on a pipeline is obviously a covert operation, and due to the nature of the infrastructure involved, we can be fairly sure that it was designed as a covert operation. In other words, there wasn't really much ability to blow up a pipeline and not have it be detected. It could be a false flag operation. I'll come to that later. But for now, let's take it at face value and go, it was a covert operation. Assuming it was a covert operation, then who would benefit the most from such an action? And who would lose the least from such an action? Let's take our friends at work. If they think, for example, that the Polish or the Americans or the British or the Germans blew up this pipeline, then for whatever motive they would have had to have done it, the most likely thing that they would have done would be to design it as a completely clandestine operation. So maybe they would have sabotaged some of the onshore infrastructure on the German side, which would have rendered the pipeline out of use for a long time. The risks for allies of the West to conduct a covert operation on one of their allies' key pieces of infrastructure would significantly outweigh any conceivable benefits that they would get to it. Because don't forget that although this diagram shows you what levels of action there are, things go wrong, and any operation will involve a layer of risk. And in many cases, that risk is going to be the risk of being detected. Things don't just go to plan, and I see no possible reason why anyone in the West would possibly take the risk of being detected doing this kind of thing. Russia, on the other hand, could have used any of these layers with some degree of confidence. After all, they're already involved in open warfare in Ukraine. Assuming that they are the guilty party, we need to ask why they chose a covert style. A more obvious, say an ambiguous attack, never mind a direct attack, in an environment where there's already open warfare in Ukraine and in an environment where the West is united to an unprecedented degree, would be somewhat risky. And so plausible deniability route works best. So the covert operation it is. This route, it has the advantage of completely knocking out the pipeline, and it puts the onus on the West to prove the culprits and take action. So in other words, depending on the West's appetite for escalation, you chuck the ball into their court. You give them the opportunity to not respond in a violent way, which after all, you don't really want them to respond in a violent way. I mentioned about a false flag, and yes, in theory, the USA, for example, could blow the pipeline up and make it look like a Russian attack. It wouldn't be easy, but it could be done. There's 2 points that make me think this is unlikely. First, the level of risk involved, which, as I said, would massively outweigh any potential benefit. And secondly, the method. So this pipeline's located in about 50 meters of water. You're going to need either special diving equipment or special remotely operated vehicles to get down there, scrape meters of earth above the pipeline, locate explosive charges on it, and skedaddle. And not only that, the nature of where these explosions occurred, they're quite distant from each other. So whoever did it would have, for some reason, needed to have planted these explosions over a wide area. It's not an impossible thing to do, but the risk of being detected doing this is quite high. This channel is quite well protected. It is quite well examined by various coast guards from various nations. What I would have done, and I suspect our Russian friends would have done, is sent a pig or pipe inspection gauge loaded with explosives and possibly a time bomb down a pipe. And that would ensure that all of your explosive can be arranged so that it blows outwards and it can get to the right place, and you can guarantee it'll get to roughly the right place within a few tens of kilometers one way or the other, and it'll go bang nicely, and it will absolutely definitely blow the pipeline up. If you're going into the pipeline from externally, that is again a whole layer of additional risk and complication, and I suspect that that is not what they did. I suspect that they used a pig. That said, and maybe some of my viewers can help me here, I'm unclear if you can send a pipe inspection gauge down that pipeline without a significant gas flow. So whether they had to open some valves at the German end, I'm unsure about that. Maybe some of my viewers can tell me. Based on that, we can see that nobody else really would have designed an operation in this way, and a false flag operation to make it look like Russian designed an operation in this way wouldn't really have benefited anyone in terms of the risk that there would have taken. So we reached the fairly unsurprising conclusion that Russia blew up this pipeline. Okay, but what does that mean? Unfortunately, the answer is nothing good. So why would Russia blow up their own pipeline? They're fighting and losing a completely disastrous war. Far from snatching Ukraine quickly and cleanly, terrorizing the West, demonstrating a resurgent Russia and having the entire world trembling at the awesome power of their modernized military, what's actually happened is that the Russian system in general, and armed forces in particular, have been exposed for the incompetent, inefficient, ineffective, corrupt, and wildly overhyped mess, a sort of former Soviet Union relic that they actually are. It's increased NATO by 2 countries. They'll also know that with continued Western support in terms of weapons and intelligence, that the Ukrainians are going to kick them out in a year. And they're not just going to kick them out of the areas they invaded in 2022, they're going to kick them out of Crimea as well. We have to understand that the situation here is edging towards total war from a Russian point of view. They're not thinking about rebuilding their economy, never mind a pipeline. Even in a year or two, the only thing that matters in Russia right now is winning in Ukraine, which is the only thing that they're comprehensively failing to do. So if the option is deploying tactical nuclear weapons or blowing up one of their own pipelines in an attempt to somehow break Western unity, then blowing up one of your own pipelines is a fairly easy decision to make. On that basis, we can expect much more of these sort of low-level covert operations aimed at critical Western infrastructure. So yes, we're likely to see more pipeline attacks, we're likely to see more cyber warfare attacks, we're likely to see more assassinations and possibly even terror bombing attacks in the next few months, unless something changes in the psychology of the Kremlin, which I think is unlikely at this point as well. So where does this leave nuclear weapons? We can see that Russia is resorting to increasingly unpredictable and extreme measures in order to try and achieve their aims in Ukraine. And of course, the ultimate flex is nuclear weapons. Now, at the moment, I personally am not too concerned about them. However, I do believe that in the next few months I will be. I do believe there is a lot in what President Zelensky said recently about Putin preparing his population for their use. And using the same thinking that we have just described above, nuclear weapons may become an attractive option at a point where Putin thinks he can sell it to his own people. And I don't believe he's there yet, but I believe he is working on it. Why might he do it? He may do it as part of the escalate to de-escalate cycle, which is another tactic that the Russians are quite keen on. So the concept here is that you ratchet up the level of violence way beyond what is actually required to achieve your goal, and then you negotiate to reduce the level of violence to a level that was higher than it originally was, but that way your enemy feels they've gained something. So for example, you lob a nuclear weapon into the North Sea and everybody goes, shit, that's a nuclear weapon. This is all of a sudden really real. Just have Ukraine, just take it. We don't want any more of this. Now, I don't believe that's likely to be a very successful strategy, but nonetheless, it is a strategy that has been deployed, albeit not with nuclear weapons, in other conflicts. We have to remember, however, that diagrams do not a war make. And when we're operating in an armed conflict scenario, things go wrong and there are risks and you have to take responses to it. So nothing that I've said is 100% for sure, and there'll always be an unpredictable fog over everything. However, I don't think I'm that wrong. So thanks as ever for watching, and I will catch you next time. Take care, bye.